Welcome to Dad's Ultimate Payback. Drop your city, your state, or your country down below in the comments right now, because I want to know how far this story travels. Every single voice matters in this room. Please note that while this story contains fictionalized elements for storytelling and educational purposes, the core lesson hidden beneath the surface is one worth keeping close to your heart. The harsh, arrogant voice shattered the sacred stillness of the sanctuary like thrown glass. Old man, get up and move to the very back right now. This pew is reserved for my mother's fur coat. It costs $30,000 more than several years of your miserable pension, and I won't have you staining it with those cheap, filthy clothes. My name is Arthur Callaway. I am 65 years old, a retired master mason and structural materials contractor from Atlanta, Georgia. I have attended Grace Fellowship Church for 31 long years. I know every single crack in the stone steps out front. I know how the autumn morning light pours through the stained glass windows at 9 o'clock, throwing crimson and gold across the polished oak floor like something alive. I even helped mix the concrete for the North Wing extension back in 1997, working through freezing February winds with calloused hands that never complained. So when I walked through those double doors on the crisp Sunday morning of my 3-month-old grandson Leo's christening, I was not a stranger, a beggar, or a guest. I was a man coming home. I quietly took my customary seat in the third row on the left side, close enough to see little Leo's face when Pastor Green lifted him over the baptismal font. My daughter, Elena, was already sitting there, cradling the baby against her chest. Her hands were trembling slightly around Leo's white christening gown, and her eyes carried a shadowed, anxious strain that made my chest ache. I sat down, placing my worn blue work notebook on my knee, a thick, leather-bound ledger I had carried to every job site for 20 years. Its cover soft from decades of sweat and sawdust, the sanctuary filled around us with pressed suits, silk dresses, and prominent Atlanta figures. My oldest friend, Raymond Miller, a retired county building inspector, took a seat near the back and caught my eye with a firm nod. Frank Doyle, my crew foreman for 20 years, gave me a thumbs up from middle row. But then the front doors swung open, and Bradford Mercer walked in alongside his mother. Margaret Bradford was my son-in-law, a 38-year-old investment fund manager at Mercer Capital, who carried himself as if he owned the soil beneath his feet. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most working men make in a month. Beside him, Margaret draped herself in a full-length, silver-gray chinchilla fur coat, a garish, $30,000 statement designed to announce her wealth before she spoke a single word. Bradford's sharp eyes swept across the pews, landing on me with a cold, predatory sneer that had been waiting for an audience. He marched straight down the center aisle, stopping right at the edge of my pew. He looked me up and down, my neatly pressed sport coat, my workingman's trousers, and the boots I had polished twice that morning, and unleashed his venom loud enough for 200 prominent guests to hear. "You've contributed nothing to this family, Arthur," Bradford barked, stepping closer as his voice echoed off the high stone arches. "Not $1, not one moment of status. That chinchilla coat is worth vastly more than your entire existence here. Sit in the dark corner where you belong or get out of this church entirely." A collective, suffocating gasp rippled through the pews. Elena let out a small, wounded sob, clutching Leo tighter to her chest as tears welled in her eyes. Margaret casually draped her heavy fur coat across the bench beside her, smoothing the pelt with manicured fingers like she was settling it onto a royal throne. Before I could even speak, Bradford took a step forward and intentionally kicked his polished leather shoe straight into my knee, knocking my worn blue notebook out of my hands. The heavy ledger struck the hardwood floor, splitting its worn spine, and scattered several faded, yellowed photographs across the center aisle. Pictures of my late wife Dorothy, a young Elena wearing a toy hard hat on my construction sites, and old building permits from decades ago. "Look at this garbage," Bradford sneered loudly, grinding his heel dangerously close to a picture of my deceased wife. He raised his hand toward the 2 church ushers standing near the doors and barked, "Security, step in here and escort this old vagrant out if he doesn't move immediately." The room froze in absolute horror. People leaned forward, their eyes filled with shock and pity, watching an elder of the church being publicly degraded by his own son-in-law. But I did not shout. I did not raise a fist. I have spent 40 years building foundations out of raw stone, and I knew that a man who resorts to loud cruelty is simply trying to cover up a structural collapse in his own foundation. I calmly knelt down on the cold floor. With steady, unhurried hands, I gathered my scattered photographs, carefully brushing the dust off my wife's picture before placing them back inside the blue notebook. I stood up, buttoned the middle button of my sport coat the way my father taught me, and looked Bradford dead in his eyes. I didn't say a single word to him. I simply picked up my blue notebook, tucked it securely under my arm, and walked down the center aisle to the very last row, where Raymond Miller shifted over without a word to make room for me. You doing all right, Arthur? Raymond whispered, his jaw clenched tight with suppressed fury. I'm doing just fine, Ray, I replied softly, my voice steady as iron. Let him enjoy the front row a little longer. He has no idea that every single record needed to tear his world apart is resting right here in this notebook. If you are waiting to see how a quiet, hard-working father uses truth and law to dismantle an arrogant empire, comment the word deed right now down below. I opened the blue notebook to the very last page, staring at the certified legal numbers, the audit reports, and the original property deeds stored safely inside. Bradford turned around from the front pew, catching my gaze and throwing me a smug, victorious smile, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting directly in the trap he had spent 3 years building for himself. Stand tall, hold your dignity unbroken, and remember, true power never needs to shout in a church. It simply waits for the right moment to let the paperwork speak, sitting in the very last pew of Grace Fellowship Church. The cold oak bench pressed against my back as I looked down at my hands rested on the worn cover of my blue notebook. They were the hands of a master mason, scarred at the knuckles, permanently calloused, and stained at the nail beds with faint, white lines of dried concrete that 40 years of harsh soap and wire brushes had never managed to wash away. Bradford had just spent the last 5 minutes treating those hands as a badge of shame, parading his mother's $30,000 chinchilla fur coat like a royal scepter, while sneering at the man who had laid the very foundation beneath his feet. But as I rubbed my thumb over the hardened skin of my right palm, a quiet, unshakable calm settled deep in my chest. Bradford saw dirt and poverty. I saw 40 years of honest, back-breaking labor that had built every single triumph my daughter had ever known. My mind drifted back through the fog of decades, returning to the bitter winter mornings of my youth in northern Georgia. When I was 22, my first job site foreman, a burly, thick-necked man named Gus, grabbed my wrist, flipped my hand palm up, and studied it with a cold, critical eye. Soft hands on a masonry crew mean you go home early, boy, Gus had barked, shoving me toward a pile of cinder blocks. I didn't go home early. Not that day, and not for the next 40 years. I learned to mix mortar in freezing rain until my fingers bled, to hoist 100-pound bags of lime until my shoulders burned like fire, and to lay brick with such razor-thin precision that county inspectors used my walls as reference standards. My sweet wife, Dorothy, used to take those rough hands into her warm lap every Sunday evening. She would gently trace the thick calluses with her fingertips, as if reading an invisible story etched into my skin. "These hands are going to build us a real life, Arthur," she would whisper, her brown eyes shining with the unyielding certainty that only young love possesses. "I can feel it. You're going to build something that lasts." Dorothy never lived to see just how right she was. When our daughter, Elena, was just 6 years old, an aggressive form of ovarian cancer tore through Dorothy's body. In less than 6 months, the vibrant woman who filled our small rental home with laughter was reduced to a fragile shadow. I remember the morning after her funeral as if it happened yesterday. The house was dead silent before sunrise, save for the hum of the old refrigerator. I sat alone at the kitchen table, put my head in my calloused hands, and wept until my chest felt utterly hollow. But then I looked down the hallway toward Elena's bedroom, wiped my eyes, made a fresh pot of coffee, packed my 6-year-old's lunchbox, and drove straight to the job site. Giving up was a luxury a widowed father could never afford. I threw myself into work with a desperate, ferocious discipline. When Elena was 9, I took every penny I had saved, secured a small commercial line of credit, and founded Callaway Materials and Contracting out of a rented warehouse on the dusty outskirts of Atlanta. I worked 18-hour days, bidding on commercial contracts by night and hauling stone by day. I didn't cut corners on concrete mixtures. I didn't cheat subcontractors. And I never took out a loan I couldn't repay. By the time Elena graduated from Emory University with honors, my small operation had grown into a thriving multi-county supply enterprise with a fleet of heavy trucks and an untouchable reputation for absolute integrity. With 40 years of sweat equity banked in the vault, I decided to give my daughter the one thing I had spent my entire life dreaming of: absolute, unconditional security. 2 years before she met Bradford, I purchased a magnificent classic colonial estate on a wide, oak-shaded lot in Buckhead, one of the most prestigious, coveted neighborhoods in all of Atlanta. I didn't take out a mortgage, and I didn't involve a single bank. I paid for the multi-million-dollar property in full, issuing 2 certified cashier's checks right at the closing table in a downtown law office that smelled of polished mahogany and old paper. When I handed Elena the keys in her new kitchen, she broke down crying, her shoulders shaking as she held the shiny brass key ring. "Daddy, this is too much," she sobbed, burying her face in my shoulder. "It's way too much." "It's not too much, baby," I whispered, holding her tight, my chin resting on her soft hair just as I had done when she was a little girl. "You will always have a roof over your head that no man, No market crash, and no storm can ever take away from you. But while I freely gave her the keys to live there, I executed the grant deed strictly in my own name, Arthur James Callaway. A lifetime in business had taught me that life is unpredictable, and I vowed that the ultimate title to her sanctuary would remain locked in my vault until I was certain her future was entirely safe. What Elena never knew, what I kept buried deep in the darkest corner of my heart to protect her from endless pain, was that my fierce protection of the Buckhead house wasn't just born out of maternal caution. It was fueled by a quiet, burning fire of personal reckoning that had been smoldering for over 20 years. Back when Dorothy was dying in that cramped hospital room, our medical insurance ran out, leaving us drowning in astronomical bills. Desperate to keep my wife on experimental pain medication during her final 2 months, I had applied for a high-interest private medical loan through a local predatory lending firm. The cold-hearted officer who managed that firm, demanding exorbitant interest rates and callously threatening to seize our modest family truck while my wife lay breathing her last, was none other than Margaret Mercer, Bradford's mother. I remembered her sharp, aristocratic face as she sat behind her glass desk, sneering at my dusty work clothes and telling me that people who work with dirt shouldn't make promises their pockets can't keep. I had worked 3 back-breaking shifts a day to pay off every single red cent of that predatory debt, never forgetting the woman who had profited off my family's deepest tragedy. When Bradford walked into Elena's life 2 decades later, driving a luxury sports car and bragging about his investment firm, I recognized the same arrogant bloodline instantly. And when Bradford and Elena moved into the Buckhead mansion after their wedding, Bradford wasted no time displaying his mother's exact brand of entitlement. Within 3 months of moving in, Bradford began hosting lavish corporate dinners for his Wall Street associates, strutting around the hardwood floors as if he had built the estate with his own hands. At a dinner party I attended, I sat quietly as Bradford swirled a glass of vintage scotch, gestured grandly to the high ceilings, and boasted to a wealthy client, owning real estate outright in Buckhead is the only way a serious investor operates. No bank, no mortgage, just pure equity under my management. He didn't glance at me once. He didn't acknowledge the retired mason sitting at the end of the table, whose calloused hands had paid for every single brick, timber, and copper pipe in the structure. I saw Elena catch my eye from across the dining room, her face pale, offering a small, pained smile that apologized for her husband's arrogance. After dinner, she found me standing on the back porch, looking out at the manicured lawn bathed in moonlight. She wrapped her arms around my elbow, pressing her head against my arm just like she used to do when she was a child. "Daddy, I'm so sorry about how he talks," she whispered softly. "He just wants so badly to impress these people." "Don't ever apologize for another man's arrogance, Elena," I told her gently, my voice firm. "That is a habit that will wear your soul down to nothing." Now, sitting in the very last row of Grace Fellowship Church, watching Bradford smirk beside his mother in her $30,000 chinchilla coat, a cold, sharp smile touched the corners of my mouth. Margaret and her son believed they had conquered our family twice, first by preying on my dying wife, and now by treating me like a discarded piece of trash in front of 200 people. They believed that because my hands were cracked and my coat was old, I was powerless. They had no idea that the grant deed to the multi-million-dollar Buckhead estate was sitting safely inside the blue notebook resting on my knee. They didn't know that every lie Bradford had told, every dollar Margaret had flaunted, and every piece of my family's honor they had insulted was about to be paid back in full. I stroked the worn cover of my ledger, shifted comfortably on the hard wooden pew, and waited for the sermon to end. The foundation had been poured decades ago, the concrete was fully cured, and the collapse of Bradford Mercer's fake empire was only moments away. Behind the polished mahogany doors and floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Mercer Capital's executive suite, on the 42nd floor of a downtown Atlanta skyscraper, Bradford Mercer was not building a financial dynasty. He was running a collapsing house of cards. To the outside world, the sleek glass office radiated absolute prestige, decorated with award plaques, imported leather armchairs, and glowing monitors displaying skyrocketing market projections. But behind that carefully constructed illusion lay a rotting, fraudulent core. Mercer Capital was nothing more than a classic, predatory Ponzi scheme, a multi-million-dollar criminal operation that generated zero actual investment returns. For 4 long years, Bradford had been robbing Peter to pay Paul, taking the hard-earned life savings of new, unsuspecting clients to pay off fake dividends to earlier investors, while siphoning millions off the top to fund his mother's garish $30,000 chinchilla fur coats, his imported European sports cars, and their lavish high-society lifestyle. Among his many victims was James Whitfield, a gentle 55-year-old retired civil engineer who had spent 32 years working long hours in the heat. carefully saving every single penny for his golden years. James had sat across from Bradford in that very office 18 months ago, looking into Bradford's lying eyes as the younger man patted his hand and promised, "James, you worked hard your whole life. Put your $300,000 retirement fund in Mercer Capital, and I will personally ensure you and your wife never have to worry about a single bill again." James had trusted him, handing over his entire life's savings, completely unaware that within 48 hours, Bradford had used his money to pay off an overdue corporate credit card balance and purchase expensive champagne for a weekend yacht trip in Miami. By early October, however, the incoming flow of new investor capital completely dried up, while an avalanche of red flag audit inquiries from federal regulators began closing in. But Bradford's most immediate terrifying threat wasn't the government. It was a ruthless offshore financial syndicate linked to organized crime cartel money laundering. 2 weeks prior, Bradford had foolishly accepted a $5 million cash injection from the syndicate's shadow representatives to temporarily plug the gaping hole in his fund's accounting books. When the syndicate discovered the money had vanished into his personal debt black hole, their enforcers delivered a chilling, non-negotiable ultimatum inside a darkened parking garage. Bradford had exactly 3 business days to provide $5 million in hard, tangible collateral, or they would make sure he was buried 6 feet deep in the red Georgia clay. The only asset in Bradford's entire sphere that carried enough unencumbered, multi-million-dollar real estate equity to satisfy the cartel's immediate demand was the magnificent colonial estate in Buckhead, the very home my calloused hands had paid for in full. On a stormy Tuesday evening, just 3 weeks before little Leo's christening, the boiling pressure inside Bradford finally exploded behind the closed doors of the Buckhead mansion. The rain lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling dining room windows as Bradford paced back and forth across the hardwood floor like a cornered beast. His crisp charcoal suit jacket was thrown carelessly over a chair, his silk tie pulled loose, his eyes bloodshot, manic, and wild with pure, unadulterated desperation. He pulled a thick, white-tabbed legal packet out of his leather briefcase and slammed it down onto the polished oak dining table directly in front of my daughter, Elena. Elena was sitting at the table, cradling 3-month-old Leo in her arms while trying to feed him a bottle. She flinched as the heavy legal folder struck the wood, sending a crystal water glass topping over and spilling liquid across the table. "What is this, Bradford?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up at her husband's pale, sweating face. "It's the future of this family, Elena," Bradford barked, his voice unnaturally loud, cracked with manic tension. "It's a standard, routine asset management trust document for Leo's future financial security. The estate attorneys drafted it up, and they need it executed and notarized immediately. I need you to sign your name on the signature line right now." Elena looked down at the document, her instincts flaring with an uneasy, cold dread. Raised by a meticulous builder who checked every single blueprints 3 times before pouring concrete, Elena had inherited my sharp eye for detail. As she reached out with one hand to smooth the top page, her eyes scanned past the dense, confusing legal jargon on page 3, locking onto a single heavily buried clause hidden between 2 blocks of tiny text. Irrevocable transfer of property management and mortgage encumbrance authority. Her heart froze. The document was not an educational fund or a trust for her baby. It was a predatory, legally binding agreement that would grant Bradford absolute, unchallengeable authority to place a massive, multi-million-dollar mortgage against the Buckhead house without requiring Arthur Callaway's signature or consent. "Bradford." "No," Elena whispered, her face going completely white as the horrifying reality began to dawn on her. "This isn't for Leo. This gives you the right to borrow millions of dollars against my father's house. I'm not signing this." The moment those words left her lips, Bradford's fake, charming persona shattered into a terrifying monster of pure rage. "Sign the fucking paper, Elena," he roared, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. He lunged forward and slammed his heavy fist onto the dining table with such explosive force that the porcelain dinner plates rattled and shattered against the floor. Little Leo started crying hysterically. Terrified by the sudden violence, Elena scrambled out of her chair, tucking the crying baby securely against her chest, her eyes wide with terror as she backed away toward the kitchen counter. "Bradford, stop it. You're scaring the baby. My father bought this house with 40 years of his life's blood. I will never put a lien on his sacrifice. Your father is an ignorant, worthless old plumber who sits in the dirt," Bradford screamed, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of fury. In a fit of uncontrollable desperation, he grabbed a $3,000 antique Italian ceramic vase, a housewarming gift from his own mother, and smashed it violently against the brick fireplace, sending sharp porcelain shards flying across the floor. He stepped closer, towering over Elena, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with the primal terror of a man who knew the cartel's deadline was ticking away hour by hour. You think you have a choice here? I built this lifestyle for you. If you don't put your pen to that paper by tomorrow morning, everything we have is gone. The cars, the social standing, the prestige, all of it. Sign the paper or I swear to God I will ruin every single thing you love. Elena stood her ground, clutching Leo so tightly her knuckles turned white, her lower lip trembling, but a cold, stubborn spark of my own unyielding bloodline suddenly flared in her eyes. She looked her husband dead in the face, seeing the pathetic, ruthless coward hiding behind his expensive suit for the very first time in her life. If you are standing with Elena and waiting to see how this evil trap backfires, comment the number 44 or the word trap right now down below before we reveal what she did next. Bradford grabbed a pen, shoved the paper toward her chest, and growled through gritted teeth, "Pick up the pen. Elena, pick it up right now or you'll regret this for the rest of your life." Elena looked at the pen resting in his shaking, desperate hand, then down at her crying son, realizing that her entire life had been built on a deadly, deceptive lie. But what Bradford didn't know, what his arrogant, greedy mind could never comprehend, was that the girl he was trying to bully was the daughter of Arthur Callaway, and the trap he thought he was closing around her was about to snap shut directly on his own neck. Elena did not touch the pen. Holding 3-month-old Leo tightly against her pounding chest, she watched the manic rage in Bradford's eyes curdle into a cold, menacing stare. She knew that any open defiance in that dark, rain-swept dining room would only provoke another explosive outburst. So, drawing on a deep reservoir of courage she didn't know she possessed, Elena forced her lower lip to stop trembling. She looked down at the shattered porcelain fragments littered across the hardwood floor, wiped a tear from her cheek, and let her voice drop into a soft, defeated whisper. "I'm overwhelmed, Bradford. Please, just let me put Leo to sleep. My head is spinning. Give me until tomorrow morning to read it properly, and I'll sign whatever you need." Bradford's chest heaved as he searched her face for any sign of deception. Seeing only the pale, shaken posture of a terrified wife, his arrogant posture slowly returned. He smoothed down his wrinkled lapels, adjusted his cuffs, and threw the pen onto the oak table with a cold, triumphant smirk. "Smart girl, Elena. Don't let your stubborn old father's ghost ruin the life I built for you. Have it signed by 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, or things get much worse." The moment Bradford turned his back and strutted into his private study, closing the door to make another frantic, hushed phone call to his offshore contacts, Elena moved swiftly. She carried Leo upstairs, walked straight into the master bathroom, and locked the heavy, solid oak door behind her. She turned on the double vanity faucets, letting the loud, roaring stream of hot water drown out any ambient sound, and sank onto the cold tile floor. With trembling, icy fingers, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her smartphone, and dialed a number she had known by heart her entire life. I answered on the second ring. "Elena, baby?" "What's wrong?" I asked, instantly sensing the sharp, terrified edge in her breathing. "Daddy," she sobbed softly, muffling her mouth with her sleeve so her voice wouldn't carry through the vents. "He tried to make me sign away the house. He smashed things in the dining room. He put a document in front of me with a hidden clause, irrevocable transfer of property management authority. He wanted to mortgage Buckhead to cover his debts, Daddy. He called you an ignorant old plumber. He's going to destroy everything you worked for." A cold, razor-sharp silence settled over my end of the line in Tampa, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the quiet, lethal focus of a master mason who had just spotted a fatal crack in a load-bearing wall. "Listen to me very carefully, Elena," I said, my voice low, steady, and dropping an octave into pure steel. "You did the right thing by not signing. You are my daughter, and no man threatens you under a roof I built. Do not argue with him. Act like you are scared, act like you are obeying him, but do not put ink on that paper. I am calling Diana Walsh right now." Within 20 minutes, an encrypted 3-way conference call was established between myself, Elena, and Diana Walsh, my family's trusted corporate and real estate litigation attorney for over 11 years. Diana was a formidable 50-year-old lawyer with short graying hair, razor-sharp instincts, and a reputation for dismantling corrupt corporate executives in court without showing a single shred of mercy. "Elena, under Georgia real estate and fraud statutes, what Bradford attempted is a severe felony," Diana instructed crisply over the speaker, her tone measured and clinical. "By attempting to obtain your signature through deliberate misrepresentation of the document's true purpose, he has crossed directly into criminal real estate fraud and attempted grand larceny. But to secure a bulletproof federal indictment and protect your father's property title permanently, we need hard, incontrovertible evidence of his intent to liquidate the asset. We need his own voice on record." However, the dangerous game escalated rapidly the very next afternoon. Returning home early from a routine grocery run, Elena walked into the living room and froze. Bradford was standing near the fireplace mantel, carefully adjusting a tiny black digital clock. Elena's sharp eyes caught a tiny metallic reflection behind the glass lens, a hidden, motion-activated microcamera equipped with a high-sensitivity microphone. Bradford had covertly bugged the entire ground floor of the Buckhead mansion, listening to her every breath and watching her every move to ensure she wasn't plotting against him. Her heart slammed violently against her ribs, but Elena didn't panic. Remembering how I used to tap concrete structures to test their density, she realized she had to use Bradford's own paranoia against him. She instantly transformed herself into an award-winning actress. She walked past the hidden camera, picked up the legal document on the table, and spoke loudly toward the empty room in a practiced, sorrowful tone. "I guess I have no choice. I'll review these final trust pages tonight and sign them tomorrow for Bradford." Simultaneously, to bypass the hidden listening devices, Elena devised an ingenious covert signaling system with me. Whenever she needed to transmit critical updates without speaking a word, she would send innocent, coded text messages under the guise of family domestic updates. A text asking about checking the water pressure in the basement meant Bradford was meeting with his shadow brokers. A message asking about buying new concrete sealant meant she had located another set of fraudulent financial ledgers hidden in his locked briefcase. The covert operation reached a breathless, spy thriller crescendo late Thursday night, just 48 hours before the christening. A blinding autumn rainstorm was hammering down across Atlanta, whipping wind and sheets of water across the dark city streets. At 11:30 p.m., after verifying that Bradford had passed out in the master bedroom under the heavy influence of prescription sedatives and scotch, Elena slipped on a dark hooded raincoat. She quietly unlocked the side service door, leaving little Leo safely sleeping under the watchful care of her trusted, lifelong nanny who had arrived through the back entrance. Elena slipped into her sedan, killed the headlights, and coasted quietly out of the Buckhead driveway, navigating the storm-slicked avenues to a deserted, dimly lit suburban supermarket parking lot 10 miles away in Sandy Springs. Rain lashed violently against the windshield as she pulled her car into the darkest corner of the asphalt lot, parking driver's side to driver's side alongside my old pickup truck and Diana Walsh's sedan. I sat in the driver's seat, my worn gray work cap pulled low, while Raymond Miller, my loyal friend and retired county building inspector, sat in the passenger seat with a thick leather binder rested on his knees. Elena rolled down her window just 2 inches, the cold, freezing rain spraying across her face as she handed an encrypted USB drive through the gap directly into Diana's waiting hand. On that flash drive was a treasure trove of digital evidence Elena had covertly downloaded from Bradford's private laptop while he slept, including wire transfer logs, offshore bank accounts, and covert audio recordings she had captured using an old voice recorder hidden in her coat pocket while Bradford shouted at his cartel creditors in his study. "I got it all, Daddy," Elena whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination as the rain pounded against the roof of the truck. "Every single transaction. Every lie he told about Mercer Capital. He's been using company credit cards to buy his mother's luxury clothes while stealing life savings from innocent elderly people like Mr. Whitfield." Diana inserted the drive into her rugged military-grade laptop, her eyes illuminated by the cool blue glow of the screen as lines of financial data, illegal offshore accounts, and fraudulent asset filings scrolled rapidly past. A cold, ruthless smile crossed the veteran attorney's face. "This is the master key, Arthur," Diana said quietly, turning to look at me. "The SEC and the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia already issued a silent emergency asset freeze order on Mercer Capital based on Raymond's building inspection fraud filings. But this USB drive ties Bradford directly to personal real estate fraud, attempted extortion, and wire fraud. He didn't just build a house of cards, he built his own federal prison cell." Raymond Miller tapped his heavy fingers against his notebook, looking out into the stormy night with absolute, unyielding conviction. "The federal marshals are ready, Arthur," Raymond said in his low, gravelly rumble. "They have the arrest warrants signed by a federal magistrate. They could take him down at his office tomorrow morning." I turned my head and looked at my daughter. Her face was pale, wet with rain and tears, but her eyes held the same unbreakable iron that had carried me through 40 years of grueling labor and heartbreak. I reached across the rain-soaked gap between our vehicle windows, taking her cold hand into my heavy, calloused palm, squeezing it with all the love and strength a father could give. "No," I said softly, my voice cutting through the sound of the howling wind and rain like a heavy steel beam dropping into place. "Not at his office. Bradford wants an audience. He wants to parade his fake wealth and humiliate working-class people in front of high society. He wants to pretend he's a king in front of 200 people at Grace Fellowship Church this Sunday. We let him walk into that sanctuary believing he's won everything. And then we tear his entire world down in front of the exact people he tried to impress. Elena squeezed my calloused hand back tightly, nodding with complete silent trust. The trap was set, the evidence was locked in ironclad legal vaults, and as the storm raged over Atlanta, Bradford Mercer remained completely blind to the fact that the quiet old plumber he had mocked was about to deliver a masterclass in absolute, unbending justice. The sacred, soaring sanctuary of Grace Fellowship Church was held in an electric, breathless hush as the solemn baptismal liturgy reached its grand climax. The morning sun poured through the high stained glass windows, painting the polished oak floor in vibrant streams of crimson and gold. At the front of the altar, Pastor Green stood beside the baptismal font, holding 3-month-old Leo in his arms. The veteran pastor cleared his throat, his warm, resonant voice carrying into every corner of the silent church as he asked the age-old ceremonial question that had echoed through these stone walls for generations. Who stands as this child's true family? Who claims him, loves him, and will ensure he grows up supported by an unyielding foundation? Before the echo of the pastor's words had even faded, Bradford Mercer shot up from the front pew with practiced theatrical speed. He smoothed his tailored charcoal suit jacket, placed a heavy hand on his mother Margaret's shoulder, where her garish $30,000 chinchilla fur coat lay draped like a royal banner across the bench, and gestured broadly toward the flowers, the altar, and the distinguished guests. "We do," Bradford announced, his voice booming proudly, filled with the sickening arrogance of a man who believed he owned the entire room. "The Mercer family claims this child, everything little Leo will ever have, his prestigious name, his multi-million-dollar home in Buckhead, his future status, comes entirely from our wealth and generosity." He paused, turning his head to throw a cold, cruel sneer back down the center aisle toward the very last row, deliberately seeking me out in front of 200 prominent Atlanta figures. "Certainly, his future doesn't come from an impoverished old man who shows up to his own grandson's christening, looking like a filthy, broken plumber who just crawled out of a sewer." Scattered, nervous laughter rippled through the front pews among Bradford's high society corporate associates. Margaret smirked triumphantly, adjusting her diamond bracelets, while my daughter Elena squeezed her eyes shut, holding back tears of pure humiliation. Bradford turned back to the altar, a victorious, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face, believing he had permanently crushed my spirit and put the working-class old man in his place. He had no idea that his arrogant outburst was the exact green light I had been waiting for. I didn't shout. I didn't let out a single angry word. I simply stood up from the very last row. I smoothed the front of my old gray sport coat, picked up my worn blue work notebook, and stepped out into the center aisle. A sudden, chilling silence washed over the congregation as 200 pairs of eyes followed my slow, deliberate march toward the front. Every step I took in my polished work boots sounded like iron striking stone, unhurried, unyielding, and absolute. As I approached the front, Bradford's smug smirk flickered and died. I stepped right past him, walked up the altar stairs, and stood directly at the lectern beside Pastor Green. I opened my blue notebook, reached inside, and pulled out a crisp, heavy legal document bearing the official, raised red wax seal of the state of Georgia. With a sharp, thunderous crack that echoed off the vaulted stone ceiling, I slammed the document flat onto the wooden lectern directly in front of the entire congregation. "You asked who provides the foundation for this child, Bradford?" My voice cut through the silence like a steel saw, clear, resonant, and cold enough to freeze blood. "Let's answer that question with absolute truth in the house of God." I lifted the document high into the air so the entire room could see the official state seal gleaming under the sanctuary lights. "This is the official grant deed for the multi-million-dollar property at 417 Whitmore Drive in Buckhead. The very house you have been bragging to investors is yours. It is executed solely in the name of Arthur James Callaway. Purchased completely outright with 2 certified cashier's checks funded by 40 years of my calloused hands laying concrete and hauling stone. There is no mortgage, no bank lien, and not a single dime of your stolen money in it." Gasps of utter shock erupted across the pews. Bradford's face drained of every single drop of blood, turning a sickly, ghostly white. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a fish out of water. I leaned over the lectern, looking down at him with pure, cold authority. "You are not the master of that estate, Bradford. You are a squatter. You are an ungrateful, penniless leech living under a roof paid for by the very old plumber you just tried to degrade." Before the crowd could even process the crushing weight of that revelation, Diana Walsh stood up from her seat near the side wall. Wearing a sharp suit and carrying a heavy leather portfolio, my family's veteran litigation attorney stepped forward into the aisle, her voice ringing out with clinical, devastating precision. "Members of Grace Fellowship, my name is Diana Walsh, senior litigation partner," she announced, her voice echoing with the absolute authority of a federal prosecutor. What Mr. Mercer has failed to inform you is that as of 8 o'clock this past Friday morning, the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia, in conjunction with the Securities and Exchange Commission, served an emergency asset freeze against Mercer Capital. The entire firm is under active federal indictment for running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme that has defrauded investors out of tens of millions of dollars. Panicked whispers exploded through the church as Bradford's corporate clients and wealthy friends gasped in terror, realizing their investments were gone. Margaret gasped, clutching her throat as her hands began to tremble violently against her fur coat. Stripped of his fake prestige, humiliated in front of the entire city, and realizing his entire fraudulent empire was collapsing around his ears, Bradford completely lost his mind. A wave of manic, cornered rage overtook him. His eyes went wild, bloodshot, and feral. "You lying old bastard," Bradford roared, his voice cracking into a psychotic scream that shattered all holy decorum. "I'll kill you. I'll tear that paper out of your dead hands." Driven by pure, unhinged desperation, Bradford lunged up the altar steps, his fingers clawing frantically toward my face as he tried to tackle me and shred the grant deed to pieces. If you are waiting to see this arrogant monster get hit with the ultimate wave of justice, comment the word justice right now down below. But Bradford had forgotten one crucial detail. He was surrounded by men who had built their strength on real, hard labor, not behind plush corporate desks. Before Bradford's hands could even come within 2 feet of my jacket, a massive shadow surged out from the side aisle. Raymond Miller, my lifelong best friend, a 6'3", 240-pound retired county building inspector and former military veteran, intercepted Bradford with the speed and force of a freight train. Raymond grabbed Bradford by his lapels in midair, slammed him violently against the wooden altar rail, and wrestled him straight down onto the stone floor with a bone-jarring crash. "Keep your filthy hands off, Arthur," Raymond roared, his deep voice shaking the stained glass windows. Raymond pinned Bradford's arms behind his back, driving his heavy knee squarely into the center of Bradford's spine, pinning the screaming, sobbing investment manager face down flat against the cold marble floor, directly at the foot of the massive wooden altar cross. Bradford writhed and thrumped uselessly against the hard stone, his expensive tailored charcoal suit ripping at the shoulder seams, his hair wildly matted with sweat, and his face pressed miserably into the dust beneath his feet. The high and mighty CEO, who had tried to kick an old man's notebook across the floor, was now pinned like a helpless insect beneath the calloused hand of a working-class veteran, sobbing in absolute, pathetic humiliation right in front of the 200 high society guests he had spent his entire life trying to deceive. Bradford lay pinned flat against the sanctuary floor under Raymond Miller's unyielding grip, his manic rage dissolving into terrified, shallow gasps as the full weight of his public ruin settled over him. But the judgment in the house of God was far from finished. The unraveling of the Mercer family had only just begun. From the fifth row, James Whitfield stood up on trembling legs, his hands shaking violently as tears streamed down his weathered face. His voice, thick with raw, agonizing heartbreak, cut through the stunned silence of the congregation. "I gave that man every single dollar I saved over 32 years of backbreaking civil engineering work. Every penny of my retirement. My wife and I were going to see the country, buy a small camper, and finally rest. He sat in his glass office, looked me straight in the eye, and swore he would protect us. He stole everything we had." Gasps of horror and disgust echoed off the high stone arches as James collapsed back into his seat, buried his face in his calloused hands, and wept openly. Before the crowd could catch its breath, Diana Walsh stepped forward, her sharp, uncompromising voice ringing out over the altar like a hammer strike on steel. "And where did Mr. Whitfield's retirement money go? It didn't disappear into market fluctuations. It funded lavish dinners, luxury vehicles, and the $30,000 chinchilla fur coat sitting on that pew right now." According to corporate card statements subpoenaed by federal prosecutors, Mrs. Margaret Mercer's coat was purchased directly using stolen investor capital, itemized under fraudulent corporate entertainment expenses. A wave of utter condemnation washed over the pews. The high society guests who had once admired Margaret's lavish wardrobe now stared at her with complete, unbridled revulsion. Panic seized Margaret's chest. Her face went ashen, her manicured hands trembling so violently she could barely breathe. But then my daughter, Elena, stepped out into the center aisle. She held 3-month-old Leo securely against her chest with one arm, while her other hand held her smartphone high, facing the congregation. Her eyes were bright with tears, but her posture was straight, strong, and unbreakable, the true bloodline of an honest builder. 3 weeks ago, Bradford put a stack of legal documents in front of me and tried to trick me into signing away my father's house, Elena said, her voice steady and clear, echoing with absolute authority. And on the drive to this very church this morning, while he thought I was silently submitting to his pressure, he called his offshore syndicate attorney, Listen to his true voice. Elena pressed play on her phone, and her speaker, amplified through the church's public address microphone, blasted Bradford's voice across the sanctuary. The recorded audio was crisp, smooth, and chillingly cold, pushed through the transfer documents immediately after the christening. Elena's going to sign this afternoon. She just needs a little extra push. Once those are filed, we move on refinancing by the end of the month. The old man has no idea. He's going to be sitting in the back row eating his feelings while we walk out of there with everything. The recorded confession bounced off the stained glass windows, exposing the ruthless predator hiding beneath the charcoal suit once and for all. Bradford choked on his own breath, squirming uselessly under Raymond's heavy knee as 200 people witnessed his absolute moral bankruptcy. Seeing her son pinned to the floor and hearing the damning evidence reverberate through the church, Margaret realized that their golden facade was completely shattered. Driven by blind, cowardly panic, she grabbed her heavy $30,000 chinchilla fur coat from the pew, clutching it against her chest like a shield, and bolted toward the side exit doors, desperate to escape the blinding glare of public disgrace. She shoved the heavy wooden side door open and burst out into the autumn air, but she didn't find freedom. Standing directly on the rain-soaked concrete landing outside the side exit was a wall of furious people, a group of 8 elderly, working-class retirees led by a former nurse whose life savings had been wiped out by Mercer Capital. They had been tipped off about the federal investigation, and they blocked the narrow stairway, their faces hardened with righteous anger. "Get out of my way, you filthy peasants!" Margaret shrieked hysterically, clawing her way toward the steps while tightly gripping the expensive fur pelt. "That coat belongs to us!" An elderly woman shouted back, grabbing the edge of the chinchilla sleeve. A chaotic, desperate struggle erupted on the landing. Margaret pulled frantically, screaming curses, but her foot slipped on the slick stone steps. She stumbled backward, lost her balance, and fell heavily onto her side, sending the precious $30,000 chinchilla coat flying out of her hands. The heavy fur spun through the air and landed with a sickening splash directly into a deep, filthy puddle of thick black mud and rain-soaked gutter grime at the bottom of the steps. The silver-gray pelt, once Margaret's proudest symbol of stolen luxury, instantly soaked up the dark slime, completely ruined and caked in filth before Margaret could even scramble out of the mud. 2 tall, stern men in tactical vests bearing the gold badges of the United States Marshals Service marched around the corner. They paid no mind to the dirty water as they stepped directly into the puddle, grabbed Margaret by her wrists, and pulled her to her feet. With 2 sharp, metallic clicks, the cold steel of handcuffs snapped tightly around her wrists, locking her hands behind her back. Inside the church, Deputy Marshal Torres walked briskly up the aisle, accompanied by a second federal officer. Raymond Miller slowly stood up, releasing his grip, and stepped back to let the law take its course. The marshals hauled the disheveled, sobbing Bradford off the marble floor. His tailored suit was torn and covered in dust, his tie twisted around his neck, and his face smeared with sweat and shame. Deputy Marshal Torres forced Bradford's hands behind his back and clicked the second set of steel handcuffs into place. "Bradford Mercer, you are under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant issued by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia for wire fraud, securities fraud, and grand larceny," Marshal Torres announced firmly. "You have the right to remain silent." The marshals marched both mother and son out through the front doors of Grace Fellowship Church, forcing them down the stone steps in full view of the entire congregation, the local news cameras that had begun assembling outside, and the disgusted neighbors lining the sidewalk. There was no luxury sports car waiting for them, only the cold steel cage of a black federal transport van idling at the curb. Margaret stood knee-deep in the muddy grass, her expensive designer dress stained black, her wrists locked in handcuffs, weeping hysterically next to her ruined, mud-soaked fur coat, while Bradford hung his head in absolute irrecoverable ruin. The high and mighty crooks who had walked into the sanctuary sneering at working-class people were hauled away like common thieves, leaving behind nothing but the muddy tire tracks of the federal van. The heavy front doors of the church closed, sealing out the commotion outside and leaving the sanctuary in a quiet, holy peace. Pastor Green stepped back to the baptismal font, looking down at me with a warm, deeply respectful smile. I walked over to my daughter, and Elena threw her arm around my neck, burying her face into my shoulder as tears of pure relief streamed down her cheeks. Little Leo cooed softly, reaching out his tiny hand to wrap his fingers around my thick, calloused index finger. I held my daughter and my grandson tight against my chest, feeling the solid, unbreakable foundation of real family love holding us together. We walked out of Grace Fellowship Church into the bright Georgia sunshine, leaving behind the lies, the greed, and the fake prestige. 6 months later, Bradford Mercer accepted a non-negotiable federal plea agreement, receiving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, while Margaret faced her own indictment for corporate tax evasion and receiving stolen property. The Buckhead estate remains safely in my name, transformed into a permanent sanctuary for Elena and Leo, while Diana Walsh successfully recovered a significant portion of James Whitfield's retirement funds through the federal asset liquidation process. I sat on the front porch of the Buckhead house late one spring evening, holding little Leo in my lap as the golden sunset cast long, beautiful light across the oak trees. My old blue notebook rested on the table beside me, a silent testament to a battle won not with fists or fury, but with patience, truth, and the law. If this story reminded you that honest labor and quiet dignity will always triumph over arrogant cruelty, subscribe to Dad's Ultimate Payback and share this video with someone who needs strength today. Remember the lesson I have carried through 40 years of laying stone. True family justice is never born out of wild anger or reckless revenge. It is forged in the quiet furnace of patience, built on an ironclad foundation of preparation, and delivered with unbending resolve. Never bow your head to cruelty, never trade your honor for cheap status, and always stand tall, because when you build your life on the truth, no storm on earth can ever tear your house down.